You haven't eaten in 2 days. You found the herd yesterday, tracked it for hours, memorized the terrain between here and there, and you were ready to move at first light. Then the sky opens up. Not a passing shower, a cold, wind-driven rain that doesn't let up by noon, doesn't let up by dark, and is still going the next morning. The tracks you memorized are gone, washed into mud. The ground itself is turned against you because wet rock and bare feet is how people out here break an ankle, and a broken ankle out here is a death sentence on a delay. The river by your camp is rising past where it usually sits, and the fire, the only thing standing between you and the cold, the only thing keeping anything with teeth from wandering in out of the wet, is starting to gutter under the wind. You are not bored. You are in danger, and you're going to be in danger for as long as this rain decides to last. Multiply that single storm by every wet season, every unpredictable front, every multi-day system that ever rolled through across 300,000 years on every continent people eventually reached, and you start to see the actual scale of the problem. Rain wasn't an occasional bad day tucked into an otherwise manageable existence. It was a recurring, unavoidable tax on survival, one that showed up with no warning system beyond a change in the wind, and one that could not be negotiated with, waited out comfortably, or ignored. For most of the time our species has existed, that scenario wasn't a hypothetical. It was a recurring, unavoidable feature of being alive. And it turns out that what people did during those stretches, trapped, wet, and unable to do the one thing survival normally demanded of them, hunting, tracking, moving, might be one of the most important and least talked about chapters in the entire story of how we became who we are. Compare that for a second to what rain means to you now. Window closed, kettle on, blanket over your legs, something queued up to watch. Rain today is basically a mood, a cue to slow down, maybe the best sleep aid you own. It's almost soothing. 50,000 years ago, that same sound, falling on the same kind of night, could have killed a person in 3 completely different ways before it even stopped. The first way is the simplest, and it's the one people underestimate the most. Cold. A wet body loses heat dramatically faster than a dry one, by some estimates over 20 times faster, because water conducts heat away from skin far more efficiently than still air does. Without tailored, layered, genuinely waterproof clothing, which our ancestors mostly didn't have for the majority of our history, a sustained rain in weather that felt merely cool rather than freezing could push a person's core temperature down into dangerous territory within a matter of hours, not days. And a lot of the environments early humans actually lived in got cold enough at night for this to matter, including plenty of high elevation and wet season locations across Africa that don't fit the mental image most people have of the warm cradle of humanity.
The second danger is water itself, arriving somewhere you specifically went to get away from it. The most reliable shelters available to early humans, caves and rock overhangs, tend to sit at the base of hillsides or near the rivers and streams that carved them out in the first place, which means they're also exactly the kind of terrain that channels a flash flood. Archaeologists digging through occupied cave sites have found thick bands of flood sediment sitting right inside layers where people had clearly been living, cooking, and sleeping. Sediment that in some cases marks the last time that particular shelter was ever used again. The place that was supposed to be safety could, without warning, become the danger itself. The third threat is the one that sounds almost too dramatic to be literal, and it is other predators, driven into shelter by the exact same storm you're hiding from. Rain doesn't just push people into caves, it pushes everything into caves. And there are documented South African sites where human remains and the remains of large cats turn up together in the same occupation layers. Some of those human remains showing puncture wounds in the skull that match the spacing and shape of a leopard's canine teeth with uncomfortable precision. Rain, in other words, didn't just make life miserable. It collapsed the usual distance between predator, prey, and person, and crammed all three into the same small, dry patch of ground at the same time.
It's worth being precise about why this combination was so much worse than any single danger on its own. A person can prepare for cold alone with the right clothing and enough banked firewood. A person can prepare for flooding alone by choosing a shelter on higher, better drained ground. A person can prepare for predators alone with fire, noise, and numbers. What made a sustained storm genuinely dangerous wasn't any one of those 3 threats in isolation. It was that all 3 arrived together at the same time in the same confined space, while the normal tools for managing each of them individually, mobility, visibility, the ability to simply leave and find better ground, had all been taken away at once. Rain didn't add one problem, it multiplied several at the same time, in the one setting where you had the fewest options left to respond. So in the middle of all of that, one task outranked everything else. Keep the fire alive. Here's why that job carried so much weight. We have solid evidence of humans controlling fire going back at least 400,000 years at a site called Kesem Cave in Israel, and possibly close to 1 million years at Wonderwork Cave in South Africa. But controlling a fire someone already lit and producing fire from absolutely nothing are two entirely different skills. And for a huge stretch of our history, plenty of groups could reliably do the first without being confident they could pull off the second on demand, especially in the exact conditions, cold, wet, low on dry material, where you'd need it most. If your only fire went out during a multi-day storm, you might genuinely not be able to get another one going until conditions improved, which is precisely the situation you couldn't afford to be in.
That's why some groups carried fire rather than relying on recreating it, smoldering embers wrapped in green, moisture-resistant leaves, chunks of a specific woody bracket fungus, sometimes called tinder fungus or horsehoof fungus, that could hold a slow ember alive inside itself for hours at a stretch, functioning as something close to a biological version of a modern lighter, portable and self-sustaining. We're not guessing about how seriously people took this. When the famous frozen body known as Ötzi the Iceman was recovered from the Alps, roughly 5,300 years old, he was carrying a dedicated fire-starting kit in his belt pouch. Pieces of that same tinder fungus, flint, a lump of iron pyrite for striking sparks, and extra plant material as backup tinder. 5,000 years after the earliest evidence of controlled fire, losing your flame was still considered serious enough that people carried purpose-built equipment specifically to prevent it.
So when a storm hit, protecting the shelter itself came second. Protecting the fire came first. Move it deeper into the cave, away from wind and dripping water. Shield it with hides or stacked brush. Feed it with real judgment. Not too little so it starves, and not too much so it burns through your supply before the rain lets up. People learned to look for the lower, dead branches on coniferous trees specifically, the ones still shielded by the canopy above and therefore likely to stay dry underneath even during a downpour. They learned to split open a soaked log to reach the dry wood at its core. They learned that birch bark, thanks to a waxy compound in it called betulin, will actually catch and burn even while damp, making it one of the few natural kindling sources you can trust in genuinely wet conditions. On a bad enough storm day, one person's entire assigned role might simply have been sitting beside that fire for hours, tending it, because that fire wasn't a comfort item.
That role probably wasn't handed to just anyone either. Tending a fire through a multi-day storm meant constantly judging fuel moisture by feel and smell, rationing a limited drywood supply against an unknown number of remaining hours, and noticing early, faint signs of a flame starting to fail before it actually went out. The kind of pattern recognition that improves enormously with repeated practice. It's not hard to imagine that this became something close to a specialized responsibility within a group. One person or a small rotating handful of people whose accumulated experience with exactly this task made them the ones everyone else trusted with it when the weather turned bad enough to matter. It was heat, light, protection from anything hunting nearby, the only way to cook food that would otherwise carry parasites, and the physical center around which every single social interaction the group had was organized. Letting it die wasn't carelessness. It put the whole group at risk. With the fire secured and the group mostly dry, the obvious next question is, now what? You can't hunt, you can't track, you can't scout new terrain in weather like this. And the archaeological record has a very clear answer for what filled that gap, because caves and rock shelters are consistently packed with evidence of manufacturing, not hunting.
Stone tools turn up in every stage of production inside these sites, alongside dense clusters of tiny stone flakes, the debris that flies off when someone is carefully shaping a blade or a point, concentrated in specific spots, exactly where a person would have sat near the firelight and worked for hours at a stretch. But it goes well past basic tool-making. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, archaeologists uncovered what amounts to a 100,000-year-old pigment workshop, abalone shells repurposed as mixing containers, ochre that had been deliberately ground down into fine powder, bone tools clearly used for stirring and applying it. This wasn't someone killing an idle hour. This was a small, organized production process, the kind of thing that requires you to already know the steps, already have the materials gathered, and already have hours of uninterrupted time to actually carry it out. Bone needles start showing up in the archaeological record around 61,000 years ago in southern Africa, later spreading through Europe and Asia. These are genuinely delicate objects with tiny hand-drilled eyes, the kind of fine, exacting work that is simply not possible while you're moving, hunting, or doing anything else that demands your attention split in multiple directions. You make a bone needle when you are sitting still, warm enough to have steady hands, and have real hours to spare.
Bad weather, as inconvenient as it was in every other respect, reliably handed people exactly that. Then there's a discovery that quietly rewrote what we thought we knew about who was capable of this kind of patient, slow-build technology in the first place. At a Neanderthal site called Abri du Maras in the Rhone Valley of southern France, researchers found a tiny fragment of 3-ply twisted plant fiber cord dated to somewhere between roughly 41,000 and 52,000 years old. It's currently the oldest known direct physical evidence of string anywhere in the archaeological record, and it wasn't left behind by modern humans. It was Neanderthals. Making cordage requires knowing which trees produce usable inner bark fiber, understanding the specific seasonal window when that fiber is easiest to strip and strongest once dried, separating and twisting individual fibers in one direction, and then plying multiple twisted strands together in the opposite direction so the resulting cord doesn't simply unravel under tension. That's not a lucky accident. That's a multi-step technical process passed down and practiced deliberately by a species people spent decades assuming was cognitively simpler than us. And cordage, once you have it, changes almost everything downstream of it. It lets you lash a stone point onto a shaft, bind poles into a sturdier shelter frame, build snares and nets, tie a bundle of tools onto your back so your hands stay free. Twisting fiber into cord is slow, repetitive, and requires you to sit in one place for a long time, which makes it about as perfect a bad weather task as prehistory ever produced.
Hide working belongs in the same category, and it's easy to underestimate how much labor it actually demanded. Turning a raw animal skin into usable, wearable, weatherproof material means scraping away fat and tissue, working in preserving agents like brains or smoke, stretching and softening the hide over hours of repetitive manual effort, and then cutting and stitching it into something shaped like clothing rather than a flat piece of leather. Stone scrapers recovered from cave sites frequently show the specific kind of wear pattern produced by exactly this kind of hide work, and that wear is concentrated, again, near the hearth, near the light, in the same spots where tool-making debris piles up. Waterproof, well-fitted clothing wasn't a luxury item. It was the single biggest factor separating a survivable winter from a fatal one, and it got made, stitch by stitch, largely during the stretches when going outside wasn't an option anyway. People weren't only making tools during these stretches, they were also making their shelters genuinely livable. At Abri Cave in South Africa, archaeologists uncovered layered bedding roughly 77,000 years old. Sedges, rushes, and grasses deliberately arranged into sleeping mats, topped with leaves from a plant now known to contain natural insect-repelling compounds. That top layer of bedding also shows signs of having been periodically burned off and replaced, a maintenance routine, essentially prehistoric pest control, carried out again and again over the life of that shelter. Someone wasn't just surviving in that cave, they were maintaining it, the way you maintain a home you expected to keep coming back to.
And then the story takes a turn that has nothing to do with survival at all. The paintings inside Chauvet Cave in southern France, generally dated to somewhere in the range of 30 to 36,000 years old, depict lions, horses, rhinoceroses, and bears with an anatomical precision and sense of motion that still catches trained observers off guard today. Several animals are drawn mid-stride, muscle groups suggested with a few confident lines, heads turned as if caught glancing backward. This isn't idle doodling. It's the output of people who had spent an enormous number of hours actually watching these animals move, then reproduce that memory accurately, from imagination, deep underground, working by the unsteady light of an animal fat lamp. Chauvet isn't an isolated case either. Lascaux and Altamira in Europe hold similarly sophisticated work, and cave art on the Indonesian island of Sulawesi has been dated to at least around 45,000 years old, currently among the oldest known figurative art anywhere on the planet. What makes this stranger still is location. These paintings generally aren't near cave entrances, the parts of a cave you'd actually want to shelter in. They're deep inside, sometimes hundreds of meters back, through passages narrow enough that you'd have to crawl. Someone carried a small flame into total permanent darkness specifically to paint there. Nobody does that on a good day with clear skies and a hunt to plan. You do that when the rain has been coming down for 2 straight days, every tool you own has already been sharpened, every practical task has already been finished, and there is genuinely nothing left to do except go further into the dark and make something. We can't prove, with the kind of certainty a courtroom would want, that cave art specifically began as a rainy day activity, but the circumstantial case is hard to ignore. The most sophisticated creative explosion in prehistory shows up concentrated in precisely the kind of enclosed, weather-sheltered spaces where people were most likely to be stuck for extended stretches with nothing else demanding their attention. Which points towards something bigger than tools or paintings. Rain may not have just produced art, it may have helped produce culture itself in the fullest sense of that word.
Think about the actual mechanics of it. 15 to 30 people forced into a confined space together for days at a stretch with almost nothing external competing for their attention. What happens under those conditions is conversation, and a lot of it. Research comparing daytime and nighttime conversation among the Juhoansi people of the Kalahari Desert found a sharp shift in subject matter depending on the hour. Daytime talk skewed heavily practical, resources, land, logistical complaints, while after dark, gathered around a fire, well over 3/4 of conversation turned to stories, songs, and shared cultural material. Firelight itself seems to change what people are willing to talk about, softening the atmosphere in a way that opens people up rather than keeping them guarded. The fire wasn't only a heat source, it functioned as the original social network, the place where information that mattered for staying alive, which water sources hold out through the dry season, which plants are safe, where the best tool-making stone can be found, how to read a specific animal's tracks, moved directly from one mind to another through nothing but speech. Beyond the strictly practical material, something else got passed around those same fires: explanation. Every human culture we've ever documented has some body of mythology addressing where rain comes from and why. And whoever first told those particular stories was almost certainly doing it in the exact circumstance the story existed to explain, sitting inside, listening to the very weather being discussed.
And the durability of that kind of oral tradition is genuinely startling once you look at documented examples. Among the best verified cases anywhere in the world are Australian Aboriginal oral traditions describing coastline and sea level changes that occurred roughly 7,000 years ago, geological events later confirmed independently through modern sediment and core sampling. Those accounts survived for 7,000 years, carried by nothing but repeated retelling, generation after generation. That kind of long-range cultural memory doesn't happen by accident. It requires groups that spent an enormous, sustained amount of time doing exactly this, sitting together, retelling the same material over and over, refining and reinforcing it until it was durable enough to survive millennia with no written backup at all. So the stretches of forced stillness that rain imposed weren't dead time in any real sense. They were transmission time, the specific windows when accumulated knowledge actually moved from older members of a group to younger ones, when a skill got demonstrated closely enough to actually be learned rather than just described, when the group's shared memory got repeated, corrected, and reinforced. It's worth adding one honest complication here, because it's tempting to romanticize rain as pure hidden blessing once you've heard all of this. Modern psychological research into boredom and creativity offers a more measured version of the same idea. Several studies over the last couple of decades have found that people given a genuinely dull, understimulating task before a creative exercise tend to generate more original ideas afterward than people who went straight into the creative task without any enforced downtime first. The proposed mechanism isn't magic. Boredom seems to push attention inward and loosen the mind's default habits just enough to let unusual associations surface. It's a modest effect, observed in fairly controlled lab settings, and it would be overreaching to claim it single-handedly explains cave painting. But it's a real, independently discovered thread pointing in the same direction the archaeology already suggests. Enforced stillness with nothing urgent to do isn't simply time lost. Under the right conditions, it's raw material. And rain wasn't uniformly bad news to begin with, which is easy to forget once you've spent this long cataloging everything it threatened. Once a storm passed, the softened ground it left behind held tracks with extraordinary clarity, deep, sharply defined, easy to read for species, direction, speed, and age, arguably some of the best tracking conditions available anywhere in the natural cycle. Rain replenished water. Natural depressions in exposed rock that fill during storms turn up near an enormous number of known prehistoric campsites, and some of them show clear evidence of having been deliberately carved deeper over time to hold more water than they would naturally, an early low-tech version of a cistern. Rain also reshuffled the entire food landscape rather than simply shutting it down. Certain mushrooms and fungi fruit specifically in the days after rainfall. Tubers pull far more easily out of softened, saturated soil, and insects that normally stay hidden come to the surface in large numbers. Termites are a particularly good example, swarming en masse after rain across large parts of tropical Africa and representing one of the most protein-dense food sources available anywhere in that ecosystem, requiring no tools and no risk beyond simply showing up at the right moment. Chimpanzees today are regularly observed gorging on exactly these post-rain termite swarms, and there's every reason to think early humans exploited the same predictable temporary abundance, quite possibly at a much larger scale, given our capacity to actually plan around it in advance.
The groups that understood this rhythm, that rain wasn't simply an interruption but a predictable reset of what food was available and where, had a real compounding advantage over groups that treated every storm purely as a problem to survive. Knowing that a particular clearing reliably produces edible mushrooms 2 days after heavy rain, or that a certain riverbank yields easier tuber digging once the ground softens, is exactly the kind of hyper-local accumulated environmental knowledge that only comes from paying close attention over many, many storms across many years, and then passing what you noticed on to the next generation around the same fire where everything else got taught. So pull the whole picture together. When it rained for days at a stretch, ancient humans didn't sit idle waiting it out. They kept a fire alive under conditions actively working against them, using specific learned knowledge about which wood stays dry, which bark burns wet, and how to ration fuel over an unknown number of hours.
They manufactured the tools, the cordage, the clothing, and the pigment that the rest of the year's survival depended on, work that required exactly the kind of long, uninterrupted, hands-free time that only a storm reliably provided. They maintained and improved the physical spaces they lived in, to the point of practicing basic pest control tens of thousands of years before anyone had a word for hygiene.
Some of them, when every practical task was finished and there was still time left over, carried a small flame into total darkness and created some of the most sophisticated images our species has ever produced. And gathered around whatever fire was keeping them alive that night, they talked, passing along the specific, practical knowledge that kept the group fed and safe, and also the stories that gave the whole ordeal some kind of shape and meaning. Stories precise enough, in some documented cases, to outlive the specific event they described by 7,000 years. None of that happened because ancient people were somehow immune to boredom. It happened because boredom, for them, came with consequences attached that don't exist for you. When your survival for the coming weeks genuinely depends on what you manage to make with your hands during the next few idle hours, you don't drift into passive waiting. You get resourceful, quickly, because the alternative is running out of tools, out of rope, out of warmth, or out of stories worth telling the next generation. So here's the actual uncomfortable irony sitting underneath all of it. The rain that could kill you 3 separate ways, through cold, through flooding, through predators pushed into the same tight shelter you were hiding in, was also, indirectly, one of the most productive forces in the entire story of human culture. It didn't interrupt the work of becoming human. In a real sense, it created the space where a huge amount of that work actually got done.
There's a version of this pattern still visible in the modern world, even stripped of any real danger. People who work with their hands for a living and people who study creative output professionally still describe some of their best ideas arriving during enforced downtime, a delayed flight, a power outage, a genuinely boring meeting, rather than during periods when they were free to fill every hour productively by choice. We seem to have inherited some version of this mechanism even now in a world where a rainstorm no longer threatens anyone's survival, because for the overwhelming majority of the time that mechanism existed, it was the only thing standing between a group and running out of tools, rope, warmth, or things worth saying to each other. Every rope, every needle, every painted animal on a cave wall, and every story precise enough to survive 7,000 years may trace back to the exact same source, a group of people soaked in cold, unable to go outside, who simply refused to let that stop them from making something.